Welcome to Season 2 of the Revenue Marketing Report powered by Caliber Mind. Our goal on the RMR is to help marketers move from subject matter experts to strategic business partners. I'm your host, Camela Thompson, and today I'm thrilled to introduce Paul Ruppert. Paul, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Camela. I have 2 decades experience in the mobile technology, media, and telecommunications segment. Throughout my career, I've integrated multidisciplinary skills spanning frontline selling, sales leadership, business development, award-winning product development, strategic partnerships, revenue operations, marketing, and long-term acquisition strategy inside startups, scale-ups, and global enterprises, yielding pretty exceptional results. I helped take a startup from scratch to a $500 million liquidity event within the course of 5 years in a brand new technology, which we all utilize today, which is text messaging.
Nice.
And I have 2 patents in the space as well. So
Wow, that's a huge breadth.
Yeah, I can't keep a job very long, and I'm never really happy in what I'm doing, I guess.
Like to move around a little bit.
Not really, but yes, you get the idea.
Yeah. So in preparing for the episode, we brought up soft skills and how selling is really important when positioning initiatives or asking for resources and not just selling externally. And some of your background, which wasn't covered in your intro, came up. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. We were talking specifically about a book that we've both read called Influencing Without Authority. And I discovered that book about 15 years ago. It caught my interest because one of the things that I've been described as being is an ambidextrous executive. And that's a fancy way of saying, well, I've got both high-level experience in the federal government as well as in the private sector. And when I was in the government, I learned very soon in my first job, when I was 24 years old, I was working for a United States senator named John Danforth from Missouri. And the administrative assistant, which is kind of like the chief operating officer of a U.S. senator, trained all of us with the same skills as to you are 3 calls away from talking to a cabinet secretary, and I'm sure, if pretty full of yourself 24-year-old, but I was a little skeptical of that. But then I saw it in action, and I had influence without having any authority and all the power that I had in making a telephone call to the right person and then expressing the interest of my principal, i.e. the boss, meaning Jack. We could indeed have a conversation with a cabinet secretary pretty quickly. So that was kind of the foundation of that type of experience. And then later on, again, in my first career, my arc of development including running political campaigns. And then eventually I was working in the White House, a very short stint, working for George Herbert Walker Bush. And throughout that tenure that I had, that was constantly in play in being able to manipulate or persuade, you in terms of others, I should say, in terms of what their needs are and having an understanding of that and not necessarily what your needs are first. And I have to say that even in the context of my own experience, I was probably genetically predisposed to that because I happen to be half French. And by the time that my first trip to France was when I was 5. And then I had spent most of my summers until I was about 17 there. And that gave me another perspective that was not always my own. It was certainly different than most of my peers and friends who lived in Rocky River, Ohio, which was a suburb of Cleveland at the time. So those factors all combined to when I was in the private sector, especially running sales and being a sales executive, carrying a bag, so to speak. I always looked at through the lens of what do I know about them? What do I know about their needs? And what are the interests not only in the room, but perhaps even outside of the room? Kind of a 3-dimensional negotiating, if you will. So all that was all wrapped together in that nice little package called Influencing Without Authority. So if your reader, excuse me, if your listeners haven't seen that, they should definitely check it out. I mean, I was looking at it this morning just in preparation for our conversation.
Yeah, and it's so applicable to operations because there's so many times when you have to influence people to get behind an initiative that on the surface doesn't seem like it has immediate ROI. So it's really important to understand how to communicate and pull in what motivates the people around you. So,
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, as I said, oftentimes in trying to get legislation passed, you're partnering with your potential adversaries. But in the political world, your adversaries are going to become your allies in many different forms, beyond just getting a vote of a support for that piece of legislation. And then lo and behold, landing in, again, in my own experience, landing in as an emerging technology, which was then called mobile services. My first job was working for a mobile network operator, now known as AT&T, but it was first launched in 1997 as a mobile services provider. Here I am being tasked as being a product development director in a matrixed organization. I'm like, okay, so I'm responsible for the outcome, but I don't have any authority over the resources. That's right. That's how we do things here. Yes, sir. Okay. Hence, once again, same type of, some people call it small p politics, but same idea. And recently, just to take one step forward, in the roles that I've held strategic partnership responsibilities, both in the political world and the private sector. And, I came across a guy named Fred Copestake, who has written a book called Selling Through Partnering Skills. And he specifically talks about a PQ. Well, you've got an IQ, you have an EQ, and he was talking about a PQ, which is partnership quotient, and your ability to see through or identify various factors that make you a better facilitator of partnerships, if you will. So good stuff there.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is probably the closest to political we'll ever get on this show. I do want to point out, I think I see less collaboration across the aisle right now, but historically, how things kept moving forward in the government was negotiating and gives and takes, right? So in order to get a bill passed, you really had to negotiate and back other initiatives that maybe you didn't initially back.
That's right. The old adage, I was in the Senate after the Reagan administration, but the reality of Ronald Reagan, where he spoke of Tip O'Neill, and my people kind of questioned that friendship, and his retort was, anybody who votes for me 70% of the time is a friend. So
yeah. So I was wondering if we could maybe give a couple tangible examples. So in operations, it's really common to get resistance when you want to take the time to put something operational in place. Sometimes either sales or marketing views it as slowing down and not getting things done as quickly, even though you're trying to prep them for scale. In those kinds of circumstances, what are the things people should be thinking about as they're garnering support for an initiative?
Sure. In the parlance of sales, what you're really identifying here is qualifying their needs and finding and exploring via questioning, constant questioning, to the point where you finally have a sense of, okay, this is, let's say their needs map, if you will. This is the terrain of what the interests are. And again, not only those that you might be working with, but also those who might not be seen in the conversation. To name drop another book, there's a great book called Three-Dimensional or 3D Negotiations. And it's written by a guy named James Sebanius. And he's a professor at Harvard Business School. And he's been teaching the same course for over 30 years now, which is called Negotiations Analysis. And I took his course 30 years ago, when he was a fairly young professor at the time, in his 30s. The same idea in the context of always look at the dynamics of what you see at the table, but also maybe beyond the walls of the negotiations that you may not be aware of. And so that's just essentially making an assessment of, where's the mutual utility? Where's the Venn diagram of your interests and their interests? And then being able to have, let's say, the deal-making skills to think outside of the box, and bring in factors that may not have been raised in the context of the negotiations, but may have, again, an interest there. It just may not be the focus of the let's say the conflict over the negotiations, which is what people are always focusing on, anyways. Let's say the conflict, the ability to resolve those conflicts, but there are other ways that you can look at an equation and look for other factors to analyze and bring to the table.
Yeah, and I like, and you touched on this, but I really like focusing on their key objectives and what they're responsible for. And anytime you can tie back what you're doing to how it will benefit them is just, it helps.
Yeah, and even in the context of, Steve Jobs, the core of much of his success, which he identified, was the ability to tap into unarticulated needs, unarticulated demand. That too requires a high degree of creativity to be able to, quote, think outside of the box instead of just looking at everything that's the procedural elements of the engagement and go beyond that, go beyond the margins and start looking at other factors.
So many times when you discover an issue in operations, it comes about because somebody has complained about something and you're doing research. So think back to that original complaint and where it's coming from, and you probably have a good start for where your
Sure.
argument should be based.
Absolutely. Yeah. Being able to do the due diligence, if you will.
Yeah. So we've talked about finding motivators. We've talked about collaboration. What are other tactics that tend to be useful if you're not making any headway there?
Well, so much of this is situational. I'm not a believer that there's, the 3-point rule to resolving all issues. And I get this question oftentimes because I do a lot of consulting to financials who are making investment decisions, and they want to have a sense of what's the differentiator between these 5 different companies. And it's like, well, they're all kind of different, but they're kind of the same. And you're focusing on the sameness and thinking that they're all the same issue or the same characteristics. And I focus it on, here are the differences, which are distinct and critical in their differences. As I say, it really depends. And this is why having an open mind relative to looking at the problem is really if there's one thing to do, if I may, I just kind of stumbled onto that one thing, which is keep an open mind relative to what the objectives are and have a sense of where they're coming from and whether there's a resolution point. And the resolution point may be immediate or it could be deferred. It could be shelved, coming back to it. There are a lot of different techniques to be able to address that, which incorporate both selling skills as well as negotiating skills. I'm a believer that there's really no wall between the two.
Yeah, no, I really like that point because the solution may be putting whatever you're trying to do on hold and addressing a more major issue for the person who's kind of stonewalling you. And then
That's right.
You have a negotiation tactic that you can leverage to later push across the thing you wanted to do.
Yeah, and I'll take something from my freshman intro psychology class, which on day 1, I remember looking at the book and coming across the following, which was, if you are looking for a friend, ask for a favor. And who said that? Benjamin Franklin. And it's been an adage that I've recognized that if you ask for help, most people are very, very reticent and reluctant to ask for help. But when you do, that's just an element of humanity in most of us, the vast, vast majority of us,
Hmm.
in the context of, sure, what can I do to help you?
Hmm.
So, and as a result, even in the context of, let's say you're as within the premise of your question, which was that operational conflict as to, look, here's where we both have common shared interests here. I'm asking you for this resolution because there's mutual utility behind it. You're going to get something, I'm going to get something. Don't claim all the value on the table. I'm not trying to claim all the value on the table, and
Yeah.
I'll do the trade-off, or I need a favor. So
Yeah, I like that. I think vulnerability has been a huge theme with, particularly with the pandemic and with everybody's lives
at
exposed through
risk,
Zoom.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, at risk and exposed because you have
Yeah.
kids running in, and we're finally finding that forgiveness we should have always had.
Hmm.
But I think, yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for gives and takes there. That's a great point.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, I've done business in 80 countries, and in many cases, I've been, let's say, the outsider as an American in that context. But at the same time, I had a better sense of how to be able to break that barrier down with a lot of different ways of doing it, even in how I dressed.
I would
So,
love to hear more about that actually. So many of us are very informal in how we dress, but we know perceptions are always really influential. So dig
hmm.
into that a little bit more.
Okay. So I guess what's the question here in the context of, do superficialities matter?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sure. Superficialities do matter because it's all taken in context.
Mhm.
And it can go both ways. So I'll give you an example. As I mentioned earlier, I happen to be half French. Um, when I was right out of college, as I mentioned, I was working for a United States senator, and I had to buy a wardrobe,
Mhm.
suits, coats, jackets, because you don't walk around the Senate or the halls of the Senate. At least you didn't then, which was now about 30 years ago when I was in my 20s. Um, you really couldn't do that because you are there as a servant of the people. Now, that doesn't mean you're wearing Gucci shoes, Gucci suits or something of that nature. But the reality was that that suit of armor, if you will, projected a certain um, reality. And the reality was that you are a serious person. And the contexts of that environment were that these are the accoutrement, the standard operating aspects of it. And later, when I was working globally and doing all the selling that I was doing across 80 different countries eventually, the reality was that I came in and I looked the part of a vice president of a global organization.
Mhm.
And the culture of the telecommunications and the media and the technology business was that. Now, just the opposite occurred when I became a consultant to Facebook.
Mm.
And this was when Facebook was just, let's call it, an emerging high profile tech company. It's not Facebook as we know today. I
Yeah.
mean, in fact, it was in 2008, 2009 timeframe. Um, and I walked in wearing kind of the usual casual, dressy casual California attire, which was blazer. I didn't wear chinos, but you get the idea. And I walked in
Mhm.
and everybody was wearing hoodies. I mean, literally everybody was wearing hoodies. Now, I had already skewed the average age in the building considerably because they were all in their, mid 20s, maybe early 30s. And at the time, I was about 40 something. So that matters on both sides of the equation. I'm not
Mhm.
saying that you have to be dressed up all the time because in that context, here's the reverse factor where I was clearly out of the norm. But in the context of the opposite way, where I came in and, dressed specifically. Many times I was asked, are you Canadian? And I'm like, what do you mean? Why would you think I was Canadian? Well, you're wearing a really nice suit, and most Americans aren't walking in with really. I'm like, okay, if that's how you feel. I hadn't heard that one before, but that was one of those. Wow, that kind of stuck with me. Um, and the other thing I have to say that this is also again from the political world. Um, when security is established for, as you've seen, like with the insurrection movement, et cetera, back in the White House as well as the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
You can get through certain levels of security based on what you are wearing. Okay. So if you're working in the White House complex, you are wearing a badge. And if you were a visitor, you would have a badge that has a very large V on it. So it's discernible, it's distinguishable, it's readily observed by security. And if you're on the White House staff, you then have these things called hard pins, which are lapel pins. Every day they change. And each pin has a different level of security that, if need be, if you're like, let's say the deputy chief of staff, you can walk right into the president's office, into the Oval Office because of that one pin. So these little things that are micro impacting, if you will, have an importance not only because of making the relationships that you have or that you're trying to establish, with those across the table, whether you're selling, whether you're negotiating, whether you're partnering, et cetera, but also just in the context of the environment that you're operating in.
Now, have you dealt with organizations that have quite a bit of conflict between sales and marketing? We've touched on this quite a bit, and I'm wondering if you've seen this.
Well, I've run sales and marketing in the same organization. So yes, I would say I have. And I'll be candid with you in the context of the marketing representative, the marketing lead in one scenario really didn't have a very good grasp of the industry. And they were putting out claims and strategies that I looked at. And finally, I was like, I had to go to the CEO and tell him, this ain't going to work for me because I've got all these years of experience. And granted, the individual has lots of experience in marketing per se, but lacks the understanding of the underlying business.
Yeah.
So
context is everything, is what I'm hearing over and over.
That's right. And instead of having an understanding of the business, they had an understanding of the processes relative to marketing. All good. And finally, in having the conversation with the CEO, and it was a little bit conflicted because he had hired this individual. And finally we came to the conclusion as to, yeah, Paul, you're right. Okay, you're going to run this. What are your first steps? And I, broke it out as to, well, I'm not going to take over that role because I've got now I'm straddling different functions. And immediately I promoted two women who, one was in product development or product marketing, and the other one is in corporate marketing, and moved them into those roles and split the job between the two of them. And approached it in that way. And that was one way of resolving it. It's not the best way because you don't want to take everybody's head off. But in that context, it was a matter of the skills were not transferable. They didn't have enough experience. Now, I've seen the opposite direction also work, where I was in as a consultant to a company that was Croatian. And it was in the context of, I came in and immediately the marketing person sought me out, the marketing lead, and said, I need to get a brain dump from you because I've got this understanding up to here. And now you're coming in and you're essentially helping the rest of the organization, including the leadership team, to raise their game and raise their understanding of the business. And that includes me. So
that's smart.
Yeah, she was very sharp. And, we spent almost like 3 days together, just going through all the different pieces of her marketing strategy or marketing plan and aligning it with the dynamics of the behavior of the industry, the terrain of the industry, the past of the industry, the projections of the industry, everything. So she was fully aligned between the processes as well as the terrain that she had to apply those processes.
Yeah. I've always seen a bit of a misalignment between sales and marketing in terms of objectives. So marketing is always trying to function on this massive output that engages as many people as possible, whereas sales is just trying to hit their number. So there's a misalignment already in what their objectives are.
Yeah, again, from my own personal experience, I've come in and as I said, taken over the sales and commercial direction of the company and sat down with even the person who I eventually fired. The reality was everything you need to do has got to drive funnel.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yep.
That's the standard. It all drives sales. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this. It doesn't have to be measurable. I can live with ambiguity. It's the nature of marketing. But let's
a lot of
figure
people
out
don't
what the
understand
impressions
that.
are. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I spent a lot of time running political campaigns. There's lots of ambiguity
Oh yeah.
behind that. You can't make those kind of bets.
Yeah. How'd that commercial or mailer hit? I
Exactly.
think it went well. We got the votes.
Yeah, exactly. So you got the idea.
Yeah. Great.
It's been a pleasure having a conversation with you.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. So,
Sure.
Paul, where can people find you online and get in touch with you?
So I'm readily available. You can find me on LinkedIn at Paul R. Ruppert, which is Ruppert, as well as on Instagram, same handle, or you can send me an email directly at pruppert, Ruppert, at gpvltd.com. GPV stands for my company, which is Global Point View Ltd.
Wonderful. And we'll include links in the show notes, which for those of you who don't know what show notes are, if you go to the app you're listening in and you tap on the show, the notes will pull up. So for those of you listening who enjoy the show, please rate, review, subscribe, and tell a couple of friends. And for those of you looking for more great content like this, check out calibermind.com.